Before starting this video, I do want to give a thank you to my patrons that support the channel. And if you would like to support the channel, there are some great benefits for you in the link down below. So with that, let's get into today's video. First and foremost, I would like to thank Wizards of the Coast for sponsoring this week's video. What's going on YouTube? This is Devin coming back at you with another video today on PubStomp MTG. So with this video, I am going to be upgrading the Eldrazi Unbound deck. Out of all the pre-constructed decks, I am most excited for this one because in 2015, this is when I first started playing Magic the Gathering and I was first introduced to Eldrazi. So I will say I do have a little bias towards them because of nostalgia. So with this video, I'm going to be breaking it down into a couple of sections. I'm going to first talk about the strategy of this deck, what you really want to do with this deck, and how your game plan is going to go forward. I will also discuss some of the great cards in the 99 of the deck, whether they're reprints or they're new cards in the deck. And after discussing those points, I am also going to discuss some of the cards you may want to consider putting in the deck. That way you could annihilate your opponents with these cards. First of all, I am getting too ahead of myself. I did want to talk about some of the commanders that are in the Precon. The first card that is in the Precon, that is the face commander, is Zhulodok. And for 6 mana, which is actually kind of cheap for an Eldrazi when you think about it, it does have that ability. Colorless spells you cast from your hand with mana value 7 or greater have Cascade. So that is any colorless spell. We don't have to focus on casting Eldrazi spells. If we do have a colorless artifact that we want to cast from our hand, we could do so, and then they'll have Cascade, so that we could put some more artifacts on the battlefield or some other Eldrazi, depending on the mana value of the card. I did also want to talk about the secondary commander of this deck. Weirdly enough, it's not an Eldrazi, but we do have Amarthus Ghost Initiate. I will say it looks like a disciple of Ugin. I'm not sure exactly what this Naga Spirit is. It does have some unique abilities. It enters the battlefield with X 1/1 counters depending on how much you pay into it. It does have another ability. Whenever you put one or more 1/1 counters on another colorless creature, you may put a 1/1 counter on Amarthus. Also, when Amarthus dies, you manifest a number of cards on top of your library equal to the number of counters on it. So for colorless decks, usually in Commander, we've had Eldrazi in the past. Also, we do have the artifact themes in the past, but now with this one, we're adding a little bit of a 1/1 counter and manifest theme, so this is pretty unique. However, with this video, I am going to be focusing more on that Eldrazi theme with Zhulodok Void Gorger. Mainly because I do love Eldrazi, and I want to make a full Eldrazi themed deck here. So with that said, first of all, I did want to discuss the strategy, some things you may want to consider when upgrading this deck, also some things you may want to pay attention to. I will say the game plan is pretty simple in this deck. You want to ramp as much as possible with a bunch of different artifacts and then cast a bunch of different Eldrazi, especially with your commander on the battlefield cascading into more. I will say there's some awesome new cards that are in the deck that I do want to discuss first of all before talking about some of the cards you may want to consider adding. So the first card I do want to talk about isn't necessarily an Eldrazi, but sure does look like one with Obtruse Archaic. So for 4 mana, it does have Vigilance, which is great for that second ability. You could pay 1 and tap it, copy target activated or triggered ability you control from a colorless source. You may choose new targets for the copy. So because it does have Vigilance, you could attack or block a creature an opponent controls, then later on you could tap this to copy a target activated or triggered ability of a colorless source. Another card I did want to bring your attention to is Calamity of the Titans. So for 6 mana, as an additional cost to cast a spell, reveal a colorless creature card from your hand, exile each creature and planeswalker with mana value less than the revealed card's mana value. I will say this is a very nice board wipe, especially for the colorless themes that need that, especially because it doesn't have to focus specifically on Eldrazi. It's any colorless creature you could reveal. Depending on the circumstances, knowing you have a big Eldrazi in your hand, most likely you're going to be exiling everything on the board that's a creature or a planeswalker. So I do find this to be useful, mainly because a lot of people are probably putting a lot of creatures out on the battlefield already while you're kind of taking your time with Eldrazi because they are huge mana costs. You could do this to wipe the board clean and then take over the board with your Eldrazi. So this is for sure going to be a staple for Eldrazi decks to come and also colorless decks. But I did want to bring up another card with Skittering Cicada. So for 3 mana, this by itself does have flash. You may cast colorless spells as though they had flash, and whenever you cast a colorless spell, until end of turn, Skittering Cicada gains trample and gets +X/+X, where X is that spell's mana value. So what's very fun about this card, you could use it as a combat trick with your Eldrazi. Say for example, you swing in with Skittering Cicada and then nobody blocks it, you decide to flash in Kozilek. Then with his creature attacking, instead of it being a 2/2, it'll become a 12/12 just based off of that alone. The same thing will apply if you are blocking creatures with Skittering Cicada. You could flash in Kozilek, for example, again and make it a 12/12. So I do like this for the aspect of combat tricks. But if you do want to make some use for removal in your deck, Desecrate Reality for 7 mana is pretty insane. So for instant speed interaction, for each opponent, exile up to 1 target permanent that player controls with an even mana value. And it does have that adamant ability: if at least 3 colorless mana was spent to cast this spell, return a permanent card with an odd mana value from your graveyard to the battlefield. So I will say the best part about this card is the fact that you could cast at instant speed. I will say there's a lot of people that do play even mana value cards. I mean, unless you're playing somebody with a companion deck with Obosh, but that's very unlikely to happen. Also do remember it's a permanent card you could return from the graveyard to the battlefield, so any kind of permanent, whether it's a creature, an artifact, enchantment, you name it. So I will say I do feel like this is going to be another staple for Eldrazi decks to come. However, another staple I do want to talk about is absolutely ridiculous. I had to read this card over and over again to realize that it is what it reads. So we do have Rise of the Eldrazi. It is 12 mana. That's the only thing that's really holding this back, but I do feel like all the abilities on the card is absolutely ridiculous. So it does read, this spell can't be countered, destroy target permanent, target player draws 4 cards, take an extra turn after this one, and you exile Rise of the Eldrazi. So what I will say, what I like most about this card is the fact that this spell can't be countered. There's a lot of blue players that want to counter spells left and right, and depending on what kind of spell you're playing, they may want to counter that one. Unfortunately, they can't counter this one because it can't be countered. So this has so many uses. You could destroy a target permanent, so it has some removal. It also does have some card draw, and on top of that, you could take an extra turn off of this. I know 12 mana might seem like a lot, but remember, we do have a lot of artifact ramp that could ramp into this pretty easily. Also, another card you may want to ramp into is Flare of Loyalties. So for 10 mana, you do get a crazy effect on this creature. It is an Eldrazi, and it has the ability, when you cast this spell, gain control of target creature until end of turn, untap that creature until end of turn. It has base power and toughness of 10/10, and gains Trample, Annihilator 2, and Haste. Also, this card does have Annihilator 2 and Trample. So in specific situations, I feel like this card could be extra deadly. Let's just say, for example, somebody is playing Infect, and then you decide to take one of their creatures on the battlefield that has Infect. Because of Flare of Loyalty's ability, you can make it a 10/10 and swing against somebody, and if they don't have any blockers, that's going to be good game for them. So that's just one example I'm thinking of. There's probably other examples that a lot of people could come up with this card. It's going to be pretty powerful when it enters the battlefield and if you do cast it. So those are some of the cards I did want to highlight in the deck that are new, but there's also some great reprints you may want to look over. So a lot of these cards are great staples in any Eldrazi deck, like All Is Dust. So for 7 mana, each player sacrifices all permanents they control that are 1 or more colors. So because all our permanents are going to be colorless, we don't have to worry about our side of the board. However, our opponents, if they're playing 1 or more colors, a lot of their permanents may be sacrificed, depending on if they do have artifact ramp that is colorless. But I would say a good 80% of the time, you're making your opponent sacrifice so much stuff on the board. I did also want to bring up Forsaken Monument. This is an absolute colorless staple. Colorless creatures you control get +2/+2. Whenever you tap a permanent for colorless mana, you add an additional colorless mana, and if you cast a colorless spell, you gain 2 life. So for 5 mana, you are getting a lot. A mana doubler is absolutely critical, especially when you're playing Eldrazi. Speaking of Eldrazi, we did get a couple of notable reprints with It That Betrays. So for 12 mana, it does have Annihilator 2. Whenever an opponent sacrifices a non-token permanent, put that card onto the battlefield under your control. So I will say, in a lot of situations, this is pretty salt-inducing to a lot of people because they don't like when their stuff is taken. Also, it will have the Annihilator trigger, so whenever it does attack, they'll have to sacrifice 2 permanents, and then those permanents will be entering your battlefield instead of entering their graveyard. I will say this is absolutely disgusting. If you play All Is Dust, you make everybody sacrifice permanents with 1 or more colors, and all those permanents will enter the battlefield under your control. So I will say that that's pretty nasty, another nasty card I do want to mention is Oblivion Sower. So it does have a pretty fun ability. I should say fun for us and not for your opponents. When you cast this spell, target opponent exiles the top 4 cards of their library. Then you may put any number of land cards that player owns from exile onto the battlefield under your control. So in a way, it's very similar to It That Betrays. You're going to be stealing your opponent's stuff. With this card specifically, you're going to be stealing land so that you could ramp further ahead so that you could get big Eldrazi out on the battlefield. However, the last notable reprint I did want to discuss is Kozilek, the Great Distortion. You can actually play this as your commander of the deck if you wanted to. I actually prefer this commander out of all the Eldrazi commander because of its amazing use. So Kozilek does have 10 mana to cast it, and whenever you cast a spell, if you have fewer than 7 cards in hand, draw cards equal to the difference. It does also have Menace and discard a card with mana value X. You counter target spell with mana value X. For me personally, I find this to be the best Eldrazi commander out there. I do feel like it's a little better than Zhulodok Void Gorger, but however, this one refills your hand. On top of that, it does have Menace, and it's a 12/12, so 2 swings away, your opponents are going to be dead based off of commander damage. And on top of that, it's a great control piece, especially if you're drawing so much cards. You can counter spells left and right depending on if the mana value equals to that spell that you're going to be countering. I will say though, I am a little biased towards Kozilek because it is my favorite Eldrazi Titan compared to the other two, but in my opinion, it's definitely one of the best Eldrazi commanders you could be playing. Speaking of cards that you should be playing, I did also want to discuss some cards that you may want to consider adding into the deck so that you can increase the power level. So first of all, you want to make sure you can get your big Eldrazi out on the battlefield, so there's some great ways to ramp, or should I say reduce their costs, like Urza's Incubator, Doubling Cube, and Realmbreaker the Invasion Tree. Urza's Incubator, if you choose Eldrazi, Eldrazi will cost 2 less to cast. Also, depending on how much mana you do have in your mana pool, you could double up that with Doubling Cube. And I mainly like Realmbreaker for that first ability. You can pay 2 mana and tap it, target opponent mills 3 cards. You put a land card from their graveyard onto the battlefield tapped under your control. It gains if this land would leave the battlefield, exile instead of putting it anywhere else. So again, we're kind of going with a stealing theme like with the other Eldrazi, but I do feel like this is great for ramping us ahead. So I discussed getting your Eldrazi out on the battlefield. We do want to draw into some Eldrazi as well. We want to talk about some great card draw selection. So the first cards I do want to talk about are actually from the Lord of the Rings set. We do have Palantir of Orthanc and also the One Ring. So for the Palantir, at the beginning of your end step, put an influence counter on the Palantir of Orthanc and scry 2. Then target opponent may have you draw a card. If that player doesn't, you mill X cards where X is the number of influence counters on the Palantir, and that player loses life equal to the total mana value of those cards. So this card is an absolute slam dunk in the deck, mainly because you have big Eldrazi in your deck. If your opponents decide to make you mill cards based off the influence counters you do have, your opponents may receive a lot of damage depending on what's on top of your library. If they're big Eldrazi, they're going to get some 12 damages out there, 10 damages, you name it. And I will also say, just to give you a little sneak peek of what I'm going to talk about next in the next couple cards, I do have some of the Titans that will make you shuffle your graveyard into your library just in case if you feel like you're going to mill yourself out based off of this card. You won't have to worry about that with those 2 Titans that I'm going to talk about later. However, the other card draw outlet I do want to talk about is the One Ring. It is absolutely insane. It honestly skipped under my radar. It's insane how much card draw you could get out of this. So for 4 mana, it does have Indestructible. When it enters the battlefield, you gain protection from everything until your next turn, and at the beginning of your upkeep, you lose 1 life for each burden counter on the One Ring. And you could also tap this to put a burden counter on the One Ring, then draw a card for each burden counter on the One Ring. This card snowballs into value after value. You draw the first card, then draw 2 cards, then draw 3 cards, then draw 4 cards. The list goes on and on the more times you tap the One Ring. You will lose life to it, but that's not a big deal, especially considering you're drawing so much cards. Also, in different scenarios, that first ability, when that One Ring enters the battlefield, and if you casted it, you gain protection from everything until your next turn, can be pretty relevant. If somebody has a big board of creatures and they're swinging your way, you could have protection from everything. So I would say this is a staple in any kind of deck you want to be drawing cards with, which, by the way, is every kind of deck you want to be playing. But this is just going to give you incredible value. So with that said, I did also want to talk about Liberator, Urza's Battlethopter, mainly for that ability of you may cast colorless spells and artifact spells as though they had flash. I will say what's great about Liberator, it does make itself bigger each time you play a spell that has more mana value than Liberator's power. But again, the main reason why I do like it is the fact that you can be interactive by playing colorless spells as though they had flash. So that is one to consider. Another card you may want to consider is Conduit of Ruin. This has so many uses. Mainly when you cast this, you may search your library for a colorless creature card with converted mana cost 7 or greater. You can reveal it and then shuffle your library and put that card on top of it. But more importantly, the first creature spell you cast each turn costs 2 less to cast. So I will say this is a great tutor, especially searching your library for a big Eldrazi, and you can put it on top of your library, and on top of that you could reduce that Eldrazi by 2 mana. So this is definitely a worthy include. Another worthy include I do want to suggest for you to put in the deck is Void Winnower. I will say this is probably one of the meanest Eldrazi you could play. Your opponents can cast spells with even converted mana cost, and your opponents can block with creatures with even converted mana cost. I will say this is pretty effective with people that play commanders with a companion of Gyruda, but a lot of people are playing even converted mana cost spells, so this could be devastating for some opponents. But devastation comes in many forms when it comes to Ulamog. We do have both versions I do want to include in the deck, Ulamog the Infinite Gyre and also Ulamog the Ceaseless Hunger. So like I said previously, with Palantir of Orthanc, Ulamog the Infinite Gyre is incredible with it, mainly because it has that ability when Ulamog the Infinite Gyre is put into a graveyard from anywhere, its owner shuffles their graveyard into their library. I will say it also does have a devastating cast trigger. When you cast a spell, destroy target permanent. It does also have Indestructible and Annihilator 4. So this version of Ulamog is pretty devastating. I find Ulamog the Ceaseless Hunger a little better because it's 1 less mana and it does have some crazy abilities. When you cast Ulamog the Ceaseless Hunger, exile 2 target permanents. It does also have Indestructible, and whenever Ulamog attacks, defending player exiles the top 20 cards of his or her library. I mean, I will say both versions of Ulamog are pretty great, but Ulamog the Ceaseless Hunger is pretty incredible, just the fact that you're exiling so much stuff. So these 2 cards are ones to consider for sure in the deck. I did also want to talk about the 2 other titans with Kozilek, Butcher of Truth, and Emrakul the Promised End. Unfortunately, the other version of Emrakul is banned in Commander, so I can't talk about it in here. But both of these are great in their own right. Kozilek has that great ability of when you cast a spell, you draw 4 cards so you can refill your hand, and it does have Annihilator 4. And similar to the other version of Ulamog, when it is put into a graveyard from anywhere, its owner shuffles their graveyard into their library. So by itself, it's pretty great value. You're drawing 4 cards, you're refilling your hand, and on top of that, it is a 12/12 with Annihilator 4. You're going to make your opponent sacrifice so much stuff. So I would say it's a great one to consider. Also, Emrakul the Promised End for 13 mana. It does cost 1 less to cast for each card type among cards in your graveyard. So again, I'm going to mention Palantir of Orthanc because it's pretty incredible value, especially when considering with Emrakul. If we're milling ourselves constantly, we might have different card types in our graveyard to reduce the cost of Emrakul, but it does have a pretty nuts ability. When you cast Emrakul, gain control of target opponent during that player's next turn. After that turn, that player takes an extra turn. Also, not to mention, it does have Flying Trample and Protection from Instants, and is a 13/13. So I will say the Protection from Instants is pretty huge because a lot of people tend to play instant speed removal. Though I will say that second ability when you cast Emrakul and you gain control of target opponent's turn could really mess with their game plan. So these 2 titans along with Ulamog are definitely worthy includes in your Eldrazi deck. So the last card I do want to talk about that you may want to consider adding into the deck is Ugin the Spirit Dragon, one of the 3 planeswalkers that trap the Eldrazi on Zendikar. So for 8 mana, you are getting a lot out of Ugin. This is a classic planeswalker in many control strategies. It does have a great +2, dealing 3 damage to target creature or planeswalker. But I will say the best part about this card is that -X ability. Exile each permanent with converted mana cost X or less that's 1 or more colors. So in most cases, this is a one-sided board wipe for us because we have colorless spells. We don't have to worry about exiling our own creatures. We're going to be exiling so much of our other opponent's permanents. So in most cases, when Ugin enters the battlefield, we're going to be exiling a lot of cards on the battlefield because of his -X ability. Also, I will say his -10 ability could be pretty devastating against your opponents. You gain 7 life, draw draw 7 cards, then put up to 7 permanent cards from your hand onto the battlefield. So that way, if we draw a bunch of Eldrazi, we could just put them directly on the battlefield with that -10 ability. I will say on a side note, a long time ago when I first started playing Magic around 2015, 2016, Ugin the Spirit Dragon was the first mythic that I've ever pulled out of a pack. So I will say I am a little biased towards Ugin the Spirit Dragon, but its power cannot be denied how powerful it is, especially in an Eldrazi deck. However, that's going to do it for me, guys. Thank you guys so much for coming by and watching this video on this upgraded Precon deck, Eldrazi Unbound. Zhulodok Void Gorger seems to be a pretty powerful Eldrazi commander. Just having that ability alone with colorless spells you cast from your hand with mana value 7 or greater have Cascade. Cascade could be pretty game ending depending on what kind of spell you do cast and whatever you cascade into. So let me know down below in the comments, what do you think of this deck? What kind of cards are you putting into the Eldrazi Unbound deck? Let me know down below in the comments again. Make sure to like, share, and subscribe to the channel. And with that out of the way, thank you for stopping by.